Good morning to everyone. We're going to be studying today Pareshat Chaye. We're going to start off by muting everyone and also thanking our sponsors. Today's Pareshat Shavua Shiur is sponsored by Eva Perez. It is to commemorate the 60th yahrzeit of her father, David Chaye Avraham ben Eliezer Israel HaKohen, Zechron Livracha, on the 22nd of Mar Cheshvan, which is today. So we thank Eva for the sponsorship. May the neshama have an aliyah. And we're going to be studying Parshat Chaye Sarah, where there is one main theme. Okay, one main theme for this parsha. And it boils down to the word chesed. Chesed, which plays an extremely significant role in our identity, in who we are, in what we do. Now, there's a fundamental verse that I would like to share with you. It is one we've discussed in the past, but it is a verse that really guides us how to perform proper chesed. Okay, it is a verse in Mishlei that tells us Gomel nafsho ish chesed. Gomel, a term that is always associated with gmilut chasadim, giving over, right, acts of kindness, concern for others. Gomel nafsho, if you do it for your nefesh, then you are a ish chesed. What does that mean? Okay, so some commentators tell us, listen here, we as Jews know that our true identity and essence is our soul. And taking care of your soul is really the greatest act of kindness, because you're really taking care of what you are about, who you are. And then Rashi says, no, gomel nafsho, when people do chesed for their family, so the nefesh here is not your own soul, but rather those that are part of you, your family, that identifies you as an ish chesed. Okay? And then we have what commentators share with us, among them the Ralbag, a great commentator, and he says the following, okay? Gomel nafsho ish chesed. And he says the following, hine, so I'm going to go ahead and briefly share with you what he tells us. If someone takes care of nafsho hachomarit, if you take care of your physical body, umachzikota, right, and you take care of it, latet lachomer hahechrachi, you give your body what it needs, its necessities. You wake up in the morning and you eat a healthy breakfast with oatmeal, right? With very little sugar, even better, no sugar at all. Okay? You are doing an act of chesed. And then he tells us you should know that when people do not take care of themselves, and this is highlighted here, Mi shehu achzari le'atzmo, if you are cruel towards yourself, kol sheken, how much more so, shehu achzari lezulato. If a person is cruel to themselves, how much more so are they going to be cruel to others? So therefore, the most important piece of information, right, to live a life of chesed is to take care of yourself, what you need. Now, they use the word hechrechi. This is not to say that a person has to live a selfish life. Obviously, that's very far from Judaism. But a person who does not take care of their needs, and my needs are different than the other person's need. If you don't take care of your needs, there's a lacking in your chesed. Okay, so this is a fundamental idea that my first responsibility is myself. After I take care of myself, I take care of those who are around me. And then I have a responsibility to my family, and then my community, and then the world. And when I walk in with an understanding that even my own chesed is eventually going to beneficial others, because when I am healthy, I could do for others. So then suddenly it elevates every single act I do for myself. Gomel nafsho ish chesed. This is a verse that is extremely important as we start this incredible parsha of journey of Chaye Sarah, the journey of chesed. Now, this week's parsha has an animal, right? It's the animal that is mentioned, I think, 18 times, and was barely mentioned earlier in the Torah. And that is the gamal, the camel. And the camel itself, as we all know, it was used to transport Eliezer to find the shidduch for Yitzchak. The camel itself is an animal that has an incredible ability to do for others while it has very little needs for itself. You could travel 10 days through the desert, right, with the camel not having any need to drink because it, could store within itself gallons upon gallons of water. And I think it's always a symbol of chesed, because the healthy Baal Chesed is a person that took care of themselves, right? Healthy childhood, doesn't have overwhelming emotional needs. The physical needs are taken care of, and then they're ready to have an impact on the world. The Gamal is the Gomel Chesed. Okay, so just pieces of information that are important for our appreciation of the Parsha itself. Now, we're going to cover three types of chesed. Three types of chesed. One is chesed for the soul, for the neshama. Okay. Number two is going to be chesed for someone else's spirituality. You hear this idea. Not your own spirituality, but someone else's spirituality. And chesed number three is going to be the most basic chesed we are familiar with, where you take care of someone else's need, right? You go ahead and give money to Tomchei Shabbos. You go ahead and give funds to a tzedakah organization. That is category number three. Okay, so here we go. When people do incredible things within our nation, I feel suddenly it's a privilege to be a member of such a nation. And there's no greater example than Lo Aleinu going to a funeral, right? Or Lo Aleinu, those of us who experience the loss. And you go through the process that the relative Lo Aleinu is no longer here spiritually. Their soul departed, but there's still a body that needs to be taken care of. And your emotional state, as we all know, is simply overwhelmed. And the incredible kindness of the Chevra Kadisha is one that we consider the greatest chesed, right? Now, there's the chesed, by the way, for the living too, because the living are lost. What's next? And then a group walks in, a group of volunteers, they walk in, and what do? They take over. They make it their mission to take care and give kavod to this individual, right? So there's a chesed for the living. But even more so, it's called chesed shel emes because they don't expect reward. They don't expect reward. Now think about it, right? Funeral homes charge a few dollars, right? And sometimes they try to convince you to get services that earn them even a few extra dollars. And it's a business, unfortunately. Even if it's a non-profit, somehow they may manage to charge a very significant amount. And many of them are employees who earn a living, and there's nothing wrong with that. But suddenly, a few people walk in, and sometimes it is behind the scenes that you don't even know that they performed this act of kindness. They did a tara. They get no recognition. It's not publicized. no reward, no payment, and they give from their precious time and effort and energy to do this act. Chesed shel emes. And the greatness of that act and the impact it has on all of us is because it is a declaration of faith. It is a declaration that, number one, our goal is to understand that there is something more than the physical. And there is something called a neshama, and we recognize it. So we look at a body as a carrier of something extremely holy. And therefore, even after the soul departs, we're going to take care of this body because it played a role with the neshama. It was like a partner with the neshama. They make a declaration of faith because they're doing it in honor of that neshama with no interest of gaining anything in this physical world. When people live a life or perform acts to teach, right? They perform their acts, and by these acts, they are teaching that we understand that there's a different realm that exists. It really elevates all of us. And it's a privilege. It is a privilege to know people who are members of a Chevra Kadisha. And it is a privilege to be a member of a nation that has such people, right? It's unheard of. Look at funeral homes, right? And look at their charges. And here you have a group of people that do it only for the spiritual. The chesed shel emes, and that's the chesed that we start off with in this week's parsha, the story of Avraham. And that's what the Torah shares with us, this story. Look at the effort Avraham Avinu put in to bury Sarah. And obviously he loved her, but the goal was for us, centuries upon centuries later to realize what the neshama is about, what the soul is about. But when the Torah shares with us this story, it wants to contrast it with another individual, right? The individual who views it as an opportunity to earn not just money, but honor. In other words, look at what Avram is doing and what his future descendants are going to do, and compare it to Ephron. Ephron, right, was the first funeral director who ripped off a family during time of difficulty. That's what Ephron was about. And Ephron had a deep desire not just for money, which according to tradition, right, he squeezed out of Avram Avinu an incredible amount, but for honor as well, right? Ephron, in our tradition, and even when you read the verse, he starts off by declaring publicly that, hey, listen, me and Avram Avinu, we're such good buddies. I'm willing to give it to him for free. In other words, you have to realize that Avram Avinu at that point is recognized throughout the land as a man of God. He was respected. And now suddenly Schlepper Ephron, right, has a law that happened to be that Avram Avinu eyed it. And here he is presented as the one that has to interact financially with Avram Avinu, a tremendous kavod, a tremendous honor. And he wants to maximize that honor. Do you know how he maximizes that honor? By claiming, I'm willing to give it for free. And the reason he made that statement is that he knew very, very well that Avram Avinu wanted to buy it. So therefore, he could declare, and he could be recognized as this righteous person who is willing to do things for free, get all the kavod, but obviously was eyeing the money. And even the way he communicated, right, with Avram Avinu, the value and how much he wants, it's an incredible, shrewd way of communicating, because he says to Avram Avinu, listen, we're so close, right? I'm willing to give you anything. I'm even willing to give you a field that costs 400 shekel, right? And every year I say the same thing. Someone went to No Frills for you and they bought some spices, and then you say, I want to pay you. And they say, no, there's no need to pay. What is $16.39 for me? If they give you the precise amount, they basically are saying, please be sure to write the check for 16.39. And no, don't round it down to 35. In other words, by sharing a very specific amount, they are communicating they want it. That is the Ephron. So here he is in front of a crowd, standing there, people watching him, getting the kavod, getting the honor, and Avram Avinu is going to give every single silver coin, because he's the man of commitment. And he has a desire also to strengthen the link to the land. And that, by the way, was part of the Kovan Ames as well, that his wife should be buried in land that he owned. That's Avram Avinu. And by the way Ephron was able to elevate the value was by Avram only asking for a cave. And Ephron says, no, it's a package deal. It comes with a cave and it comes with a field, right? Like the things they sell you on TV, some unnecessary container, right? That if you buy it, your life will be perfect. And if you call right now, we're going to give you not one, but 4 of them for $19.99 plus shipping and that, plus handling and shipping. So the idea is he's trying to take that which Avram needs, right? Enhance it with something that really Avram did not need, which was the field, but he was able to charge more. Avram Avinu was committed for Kavod Ames to do whatever was needed. That is, Avram Avinu is a member of a Chevra Kadisha. Ephron was there to rip him off and walk out hoping that he gets a perfect review on Google, right? Because that was his desire, the kavod and the money. That's Mr. Ephron. In our tradition, when you want to talk about someone that wants the max, you look at number 400. Why number 400? Because when you look at our alphabet at the Aleph Beis and Gematriot, the last letter has the numerical value of 400. Ephron is a Mr. 400. He wants the max. He wants the honor, and obviously he wants the money. And when Ephron gets the money, the Torah spells his name without a vav because he turns into Ephron without a vav. The numerical value of the ayin, the pei, the resh, and the nun is 400. These are things we discussed in the past, but we're focusing here on the contrast. And the lesson of Torah for us is always for eternity. For many human beings, we struggle with this concept of identity. Who am I, right? What am I? And I really, really feel for those who do not have a faith and a tradition to give them that identity, because you feel lost without it. I cannot comprehend a life without believing in a higher being and without believing that there's something more than the physical body. I simply cannot comprehend it. But people try to find something to cling to, and that becomes their identity. Okay, now sometimes they are very healthy things. There are people, ethical people, they may not be believers in God, but they want to do good, they want to do nice things, and that becomes their identity. They're doing good, we have to recognize that has value. And then there are those that it is their financial status that defines who they are, right? And they collect money. I am valuable because I have money, right? Judaism teaches that, I'm sorry, that's absurd. That's your whole identity. You don't take it with you, right? That's your identity. Money is great, by the way. You could do some incredible things with it, right? You could support organizations. You could do tzedakah, support Torah learners. The list is very long, but view it as a tool, not your identity. And then there are those that if they are winners, then they are people of value. I mean, I'm not going to get into politics, believe me, right now, but I hope that even those who supported, I should use, Trump in the past, realize what a flawed person this is, right? And this is a person that being a winner defines that you're great. And here you have it, Nebuch, if that is his whole identity and his whole essence, you got to have a little bit of Rahmanas for him right now, because he is, yes, a loser, a term that he loved using upon others. He is the loser now. That's the struggle that humanity has, that it is part of the human condition, existential struggles that they have. Our identity and the knowledge that we have in Neshama suddenly changes everything. It changes everything because suddenly we have direction and we have guidance. And you read a parsha and you look at people who are involved in Kavod Hames, the chesed they do is not just to the neshama of that person. The chesed that Avraham Avinu does is something that we today could be inspired because it reminds us we have something more than the physical. And we value, by the way, the physical. Be an ish chesed, right? There's a mitzvah to eat the healthy breakfast. And yes, a good cup of coffee, if you enjoy it, is a mitzvah. It's a tremendous way of appreciating the higher being. But it's not a goal. It's a mean, right? And the mean is wonderful. Know who you are. Know who you are. And that becomes clear when you see people involved in performing a chesed to one who is no longer alive, and they realize, you know what, there's something more to it. So that's chesed number one. We said there were three categories of chesed that we're going to address. Chesed number one is the chesed to the neshama. And I do believe Sarah is not the only one that benefited from what we read. We all do many years later. Chesed number two. Now, sometimes you interact with people in Israel, and we have some people in Israel right now, and they have this view that we outside of Israel are really, really, really in a wrong place, right? We're not where we belong. Now, they're right. They are right, right? I'm the first one to tell you we belong in Eretz Yisrael. I deeply feel guilty that I don't live in Eretz Yisrael. Some technical issues don't make it possible, but I still pray to the Almighty that I'll make it to Eretz Yisrael be'ezras Hashem. Now, living in Eretz Yisrael is viewed as an ideal, but at the same time, there's an understanding that you could be a good Torah Jew outside of Israel as well. It's possible, right? Some great rabbinic figures, we would all agree, had influence throughout the Jewish world. We're mourning now the loss of Chief Rabbi, the Lord Sachs. We're mourning the loss of the son of Ramosha Feinstein, some great people who were not living in Israel and had a tremendous impact indeed. Now let's look at the Avot. Let's look at the patriarchs. Avram Avinu was the first Oleh. He was the first Oleh. He was the first one who made his way to Eretz Yisrael. Yaakov Avinu was the first one who was a temporary Yored, and then unfortunately he had to leave Eretz Yisrael again. So he left Israel twice. You could just imagine how much Yaakov Avinu had to deal with Misrad HaPnim, right? And, you know, maybe that's why he lived 147 years, because he stood in line. Because think about it. He had to leave Israel, come back to Israel, leave again. That was Yaakov Avinu. So leaving Israel for a patriarch, no one should tell me that it is some terrible, unacceptable, un-Jewish thing to leave Israel for a patriarch. And so too for us. Now, there are halachos, by the way. If you live in Israel and you want to leave Israel, there has to be a reason for comfort to go ahead and see Dubai. I don't know if that's considered a strong enough reason to leave Eretz Yisrael. And according to some, to leave Eretz Yisrael just to pray at some graves in Europe, it depends who you ask. Some rabbis perhaps would allow it. Others would tell you, you don't leave the land of Israel. There's a well-known story that someone came once to Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach in Beit Vegan and said that he wants to travel to Eastern Europe to daven by Kivrei Tzadikim, by the grave of the righteous. And Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach says to him, why do you have to travel so far? Across the street here on Har Herzl, you have soldiers who gave their life for Medinat Israel. They are Kedoshim Utahorim. Go daven there. So this is a story of Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. Two important lessons there. But one of them, leaving Israel, is not something that halachically is just okay. There is a question involved. I'll never forget, there was a shliach in Memphis. It was a Torah Metzion Kollel in Memphis. They send these bochrim who finished the army, and they would come teach there for a year. And as you know, Israelis, when in general, usually when they come to Chutz La'aretz, they see everything. Like if you want to know what to see in Canada, speak to an Israeli, right? They've been to PEI and Vancouver. Like I'm a Canadian, right? A proud Canadian. I was born here, born on Finch, and I haven't been to 1/10 of what an Israeli sees within a couple months of being here, right? They've been everywhere, Algonquin, PEI, Vancouver, Lake Louise. So when I was schmoozing with this very committed young Torah Metzion fellow at the end of his year there, And I asked him, okay, Gamalta Tashana, you completed the year. What's your plan? And he says, I'm hopping on the next plane to Israel. And he explained to me that I came here to teach Torah. Now that I finished, I have to go back to Israel immediately. I don't see any halachic heter to be away from the land more than needed. There was a committed fellow. They had a magnificent group there in Memphis. So my point is more, leaving Israel is acceptable, not a crime. And now we're going to get to my question. Why was Avraham Avinu so determined and so intense that for him, Yitzchak leaving the land would be unacceptable? That means you know the story. Avraham Avinu realizes that Yitzchak needs a shidduch. He goes ahead and he communicates with his servant Eliezer the following. The local girls are simply unacceptable. They're unacceptable. I need you to travel to my original region, to Haran, to Aram Naharaim. I need you to go ahead and travel north. But there's a problem here. The problem is that my son Yitzchak cannot leave the land of Israel. And Eliezer says to him, okay, you want a shidduch, fine, but what happens if they want Yitzchak to come there eventually? And Avraham Avinu says, no, the whole deal is off. The whole deal is off if Yitzchak needs to leave the land of Israel. So the question is, and this is something that, you look through the commentators, what's the big deal? Let Yitzchak go. Right? Isn't it an ideal, right, to travel? He couldn't rent a camel and make his way on a date. The idea of having Eliezer doing it and the warning of Raket Bni al Tashiv Sham, like this is the most important thing, is that Yitzchak is not to leave the land of Israel. And we find that this is consistent because in next week's Parsha, when there's a famine, and Yitzchak is eyeing a journey to Egypt as his father did, God Almighty communicates this same idea with him. You, Yitzchak, you are not to leave the land of Israel. Okay? What's the idea behind it? Now, when you look at the life of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, the rabbis share with us a tradition that all of them were supposed to live till 180. Avram Avinu dies 5 years before that, 175. Nishlach, right, 175. So the matter shares with us that God Almighty had mercy on him, that he should not see his grandson Esav leaving the path of the family. Okay? In other words, he was supposed to be 180. And so too when they look at Yaakov, he was supposed to be 180, but for whatever reason, it was downgraded to 147. Okay, so it comes out that the only one that reached this ideal age for a patriarch was Yitzchak. And based on that, it seems to be, and this is a concept that's mentioned by a few commentators, my father would mention it as well, Yitzchak Avinu could be viewed as the ideal patriarch. The ideal patriarch. And what do we mean? What do we mean by that? South of the border, back to the United States, the Jewish community over the past few decades, especially the Orthodox community, has become more aligned with religious communities that are not Jewish, like the evangelicals, right, south of the border, and here too to some extent. Now, it obviously is a shift, which we've talked in the past. I think it's a gift from above because overall the evangelicals love Israel and trying to avoid politics to the best of our ability. But this alignment brings about a little bit of a danger because, yes, I interacted, believe me, I interacted with evangelicals in Memphis. We love Israel, they love Israel, right? No question about it. They believe in values. We too have family values, religious values. But there are differences because we're not fundamentalist. In other words, we as Torah Jews recognize that the Torah itself gave us a system to adapt and adjust to new realities called Torah Sheba'al Peh. Right? Torah Sheba'al Peh. We have great Talmidei Chachamim who have the ability to recognize that, yes, perhaps once upon a time there was a tradition regarding a specific manner, but now we need to adjust within Torah, right? And it should be defended by Torah. And that's what a great Torah leader, by the way, is. Someone that's in tune with the needs and realize we're not fundamentalists that have to do everything the way it was done 3,000 years ago. We have to do it based on the values of 3,000 years ago, but the Torah has a Torah Sheba'al Peh, and that is how we have it in existence till now and from now on as well. Fundamentalists are not, and there are areas where you see a difference between the religious among us and lahavdil, the religious among them. And a perfect example is leading into the Civil War in the 1860s in the United States. There were preachers, and there are records about it, that there were preachers in the South who declared that we must fight emancipation. We cannot grant the blacks their freedom because it's against the Bible. It's against the Bible. Because if throughout the Bible they had slaves, so how on earth can you put an end to an institution that existed in the Bible? And there are recorded sermons. And by the way, there are recorded sermons from rabbis who argue the following from the same era, 1860s, and they're more in the north, obviously. And they are arguing, wait a second, not everything in the Bible should be viewed as an ideal, but rather the Bible was given to a world, and based on what existed in the world, the Bible gives guidance. But in no way should you view it as an ideal. And that's the Torah way of reading this text. That is how we approach it. Don't view everything as an ideal. Sometimes there are laws that are given because of circumstances, and the Torah tells us how to live with those circumstances, but please don't view it as an ideal. If you remember in Devarim, when it comes to the beautiful woman found in the battlefield, are you really telling me that it's an ideal to say, take such a woman? Or is the Torah telling us, listen here, it's war, people act like animals, there are sensitivities that go out the window during that period of time. When you, male, cannot control your desires, let me tell you how to work with it. It's not an ideal, and so too when it comes to slavery, okay? So this is a difference that we have the ability to understand that Torah was given to a world and not a text that should be used as a fundamentalist. And that also clarifies the issue of the several wives that our patriarchs had. And again, there were those who argued you cannot go ahead and ban polygamy. It's in the Bible. It's in the Bible, right? How do we respond? You know how we respond? It was not an ideal. It was not an ideal. Now, again, the world changed, and obviously it's something that's extremely dysfunctional, and you could read the Bible to understand how dysfunctional it is, but don't view it as an ideal. And to prove to you that it is not an ideal, let's look at our ideal patriarch, the one who reached the 180, Yitzchak, one wife. That is the ideal. Okay, so that's the idea of how we shall look at Yitzchak's age and how to learn from him. And based on that, we can also understand Yitzchak Avinu is not to leave the land of Israel because the ideal Jew is one with Eretz Yisrael, right? We are one with God, we are one with Eretz Yisrael, and you never leave that which is your whole essence and identity. Yitzchak, the ideal Jew, never left Eretz Yisrael. And by the way, you can meet in Israel people that say with pride, I never left Eretz Yisrael. You'll meet them, right? And with pride, right, a badge of honor, I never left this land. That's the Yitzchak. And suddenly we have here, now that we understand this, look at the challenge that Yitzchak has. Look at this challenge that Yitzchak and his father have. He needs to find a wife. The locals are destructive, right? The commentators note that the locals in Eretz Yisrael were not just people that had the wrong philosophy, but they had bad midos, right? They were their personalities, their traits were simply corrupt. And for Avram Avinu, this was unacceptable. Continuity cannot come when you have a corruption with their midos, with their attributes, with their personality. So therefore, he sought a wife from a region where he felt they are better people. They are refined. They might be wrong, and might have to go through some adjustment in hashkafa and outlook, but at least they are decent people. And it is something that I always view. It is far easier to interact with someone that might be wrong in philosophy than interacting with someone that's simply a corrupt person that is not refined at all. But listen to the challenge here. Yitzchak needs a wife from a region that he can't go to. He can't take a local woman. He needs a wife from a region. So the person who performs the act of bringing that wife, that is what we would call category number 2 of chesed. A chesed for ruchniut. In other words, the spirituality of another person needs something, right? He cannot leave his spiritual realm for whatever reason, and you go ahead and do things for him, right? You bring him his needs because he cannot leave that area that for whatever reason he cannot depart. That is the act of chesed. It perhaps could relate, and when you go ahead, and sometimes you'll be asked for charities from organizations that, in general, you don't agree with their philosophy, right? They're not Zionists as much as you would want, right? They don't encourage their students to get an education, whatever it is. So perhaps you could go ahead and argue that due to the fact that it is something spiritual, right or wrong, but for them it is their spiritual existence that limits them, there is an act of chesed even in that. Okay, category number 2, you could develop it on your own, but the third one obviously is the act of Rivka, right? The act of Rivka, her chesed by the well, to go ahead and give the water to Eliezer, and that's the story that we are familiar with. But there's a fourth one as well. Now, when Rivka is on her way to the land of Israel at the end of the Parsha, and she sees Yitzchak from a distance. So the Torah actually describes where Yitzchak is coming from. The Torah describes what is Yitzchak doing out there in the field, right? V'Yitzchak ba, so the Torah describes, this is in verse 62 of the long chapter 24, V'Yitzchak ba, mibo, and Yitzchak came from having gone to a place called Be'er Lachai Ro'i. Be'er Lachai Ro'i. What is he doing in Be'er Lachai Ro'i? Why does the Torah describe it? So the oral tradition clarifies the following. Hagar, Avraham Avinu's wife that we read about, the mother of Ishmael, she dwelled there. And Yitzchak decides that perhaps it is time to bring them together. Okay. And the Torah, we know the story. Yitzchak goes out lasuach basadeh, right? He goes out to the field lasuach, to go ahead and supplicate. We said that is prayer. And Rivka sees him. Fine. So why specifically now does Yitzchak decide to bring Keturah / Hagar back into Avraham Avinu's house? Why specifically now? So some of the commentators note the following. Avraham Avinu lost his wife. Yitzchak took over the role of taking care of his father's needs. Now Yitzchak recognizes, knowing that the servant was sent to find him a shidduch. So now he is going to be focusing on his Shana Rishona, on the beginning of his journey in marriage. So since he's going to be focusing on his journey in a new life, he needs someone else to take over the role of taking care of the father. Okay, if the concept of a wife being there to go ahead and take care of a father, I remember reading about some Hasidic Rebbe who lost a wife, and this is a few decades ago, and he married a younger woman because he needed someone there to take care of him. So this is something that for some perhaps would be a little bit foreign, but the concept, as you know and as you have read of, does exist. So Yitzchak now is performing an act of kindness of getting a wife for his father because he can no longer go ahead and continue with the service. So there are two important points here that we could go ahead and sum up our chesed discussion of the parsha. Point number one, can you imagine Yitzchak's emotions regarding this woman? Right? He obviously inherited from his mother a feeling that this is a woman that, did not respect her, as you remember. The woman that brought forth Ishmael, that also was not exactly having a very positive influence on Yitzchak. But nevertheless, the concern that he had for his father seemed to be greater than his own, what he was about. And often the Baal Chesed, the person who is healthy, the person who took care of themselves, could go ahead and perform an act of kindness, because sometimes people, when they want things done for others, it is based on their own agenda. In other words, I'm going to go ahead and give advice to someone at times, not because it is the best thing for them, but it might look very good for me, right? When you are self-centered, even your advice is influence. The famous a story I share. Imagine you have a Torah organization, okay, a kollel, which is an incredible organization. Your kollel, has difficulty financially, and you have 20 supporters, and each one of them gives $5,000 a year. Okay, now one of them approaches you and says to you the following: hello, my name is Plony. I support you every year $5,000, and that's because I earn 200. I have this opportunity that if I am successful, I'm planning to invest in the market and Pfizer, whatever it is. If I am successful, I could become a multimillionaire, and I'm going to support you not just $5,000 a year, but 50, 60, perhaps $100,000 a year. However, if I don't succeed, right, I'm finished financially. So it's a 50-50 here, okay? 50% chance that I do succeed, 50% chance not. What's your advice? Okay, so let's say I'm that head of the kollel, and I'm being asked the question. So let's analyze it. Let's start off addressing the question, thinking what's best for me. Remember, I'm the one that's concerned that my organization has money. And I say to myself, wait a second, 50-50 chance. If he succeeds, that's it. I don't have to worry about money anymore. If he fails, okay, so one of that, so I'm going to be down 5%. That I can manage. So what would be the piece of advice I give? What would be the piece of advice I give if I would be self-centered? If the goal would be me, go for it. Now, on the other end, if I start thinking about him, if my goal is he came for advice, I want to know what's best for you. So I said to Mr. Plony, tell me, do you have what you need? Yes. Are you comfortable? Are you taking care of your family? Right? What do you need more money for? Well, fancier vacations, perhaps. So I would say to him, if my advice would be based only on what's best for him, you know what I would say to him? What do you need this for? Continue, be happy with what you have. You study Torah, you do acts of kindness. Why gamble? Why gamble if chas v'shalom you lose everything? It is so important that when you give advice, which is an act of chesed, it's not about you, right? It's not about you. It's about the person. And sometimes you give advice, even perhaps it may not be beneficial for you. Yitzchak Avinu's chesed, the fourth chesed of the parsha, he is the one that brings back this wife because he says, this is what my father needs. I can imagine he visited his father, right, for many years after this, many years after this, right? The father lived another 35 years after this event. For 35 years, he had to see the woman that causes some agmas nefesh to his mother. Yitzchak was a human. I could believe that it was a challenge for him, but it was a chesed of a man thinking about the other. That's the fourth chesed that we end the parsha. And if a person asks themselves, how can I succeed with chesed, right? If sometimes it takes that toll. So I think also there's a hint here to tefillah. You know, that Yitzchak Avinu established the mincha prayer. And the rabbis tell us that when Vayetze Yitzchak lasuach basadeh, and it was Lashon Siach, right? It was a conversation with the Almighty. And it appears that an integral part of chesed that can really have an influence on others, you need assistance from above. And Yitzchak here is teaching us that in the parsha of chesed, you need prayer as well. The parsha does end perhaps with some reward of chesed, right? And the parsha ends with the burial of Avraham, but according to tradition, the fact that the Torah tells us, presents the order of who were the ones involved in the burial, Yitzchak and Ishmael. The fact that it was presented in that order, according to tradition, was that Ishmael ends his life by doing tshuva, meaning if you would interview Ishmael at the end of his life, he would not be arguing as he did earlier, and as we're going to address in the future as well, that the land belongs to him and that Yitzchak is really a foreigner, but rather he's going to have an understanding, right, that Yitzchak is the one that land of Israel was given to. And there's going to be peace between Yitzchak and Ishmael. And I'm sure over the years you've heard that our tradition also teaches us that that's the attitude we should take towards the Muslim world. And perhaps one day, we're going to have the ability to look back at this period of time, and perhaps one day look back at the Trump presidency and realize that it was Me'ez Hashem Haisazos, because no other Republican would have brought forth the embassy to Yerushalayim. No one else would have put the effort he did, right, to the deals, to the peace deals, which are, by the way, going to live way beyond his presidency. And I see a hand of God already now in everything that takes place. And perhaps there's a little bit of a reference to this peace that we're going to merit. And we should hear good news. We heard already a little bit of good news today, that with Pfizer announcing that it's 90% effective and it's having 100% impact on the market. Let's daven indeed. Our tefillah always should continue that the Almighty should inspire these companies and individuals who are involved and working very, very hard to bring a vaccine, to bring a refuah, and that we could live in a world where we appreciate all we have and continue doing acts of chesed on all ends. Thank you again, Eva, for sponsoring. And thank you, everyone, for participating.